Hello and welcome to the Justice Center podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a quick reminder, Justice Center as an organization is supported by donors. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So if you are interested in supporting the things that we do and you benefited from it, please go to justincenter.org and go to our donate page there. Well, the program today is one that I have been asked to do a lot, and that is to talk about Anglicanism. Now, I'm no expert on Anglicanism. It doesn't mean I haven't read, Anglican theologians, but I don't have the greatest understanding in terms of what some of, the divisions are in Anglicanism and some developments historically and contemporary developments. So I thought, maybe more than just me kind of rattling on about something that I'm not an expert in, I would have an Anglican on the program. So I have done that. So I'm joined today by Reverend Dr. Eric Parker. And Father Parker is the rector of St. Paul's Anglican Church in Lexington, Virginia. He's also involved with the North American Anglican as well as the Davenant Institute. So welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Cooper. It's good to be on. I hope I can call you Jordan.
Oh, yeah, please. You don't have to call me doctor.
You had your bow tie on, so I thought maybe doctor would be more appropriate.
Yes, yeah. So, first of all, why don't you kind of tell us what some of the things that you do are, just so people know where to find you, and then you're teaching an upcoming course that I think some of my listeners may be really interested in. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I am currently a lecturer for the Davenant Institute. Right now I'm teaching a course on Lancelot Andrewes. So my interest as a historian has always been in historical theology. So looking more at the sources of what we think of today as the Protestant expression of Christianity. So I've been teaching that course with Davenant, and at the same time, I'm here in Lexington. I'm a rector of an Anglican parish, a traditional Anglican parish, and I'm also a chaplain and a Bible teacher at a local boys' school. So I wear quite a few hats, but those are the things I'm currently working on. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. So you have an upcoming course, though, you're doing on Luther and mysticism.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, which is an interesting topic and one that I've talked about a lot. So I have people asking me about that topic quite a bit. And so there may be interest there. So if someone was interested in signing up, where would they go to sign up for that?
So just go to the Davenant Institute website, davenant.org, I believe, but you can find it easily on it with a Google search. And look for the Davenant. Once you're on the page, look for the Davenant Hall courses. So they actually have a program, a master's in classical Protestantism that they are promoting through that. So you can sign up for that, or you can also audit the course, which many people have decided to do for the Lancelot Andrewes course. I encourage anyone who is. It's not really meant to be a seminary level course. So if anyone who's interested in Luther or Luther more broadly interpreted from a more broadly Protestant perspective is interested, I encourage them to sign up for that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So Davenant does some great work. I know you guys do some kind of similar stuff to what we do with the wider institute here. So, I think it's a very positive thing that these kind of different groups are forming. North American Anglican as well, which I know you're associated with, which are trying to recapture these classical Protestant traditions. Kind of a move away, I think, from where American evangelicalism has been for so long without any real historical rootedness.
Right.
So it's an encouraging thing to see, especially because I am always seeing people jumping to Rome, and I want them to see that there are real classical Protestant options. It's not that if you discover the Church Fathers or the history of the Church, all of a sudden you have to jump to Rome or to the East.
Right.
So within those classical Protestant traditions, we have the Lutheran and Anglican. And, I've spoken a lot about the Reformed tradition, but more so not dealing so much with Anglicanism, but with Puritanism and Presbyterianism, because that's kind of my own church background. And I'm, very familiar with those debates and the kind of things going on in that world of the, say, OPC or PCA, RPCNA, all of those things. I'm not as aware of what's going on within the Anglican Church. And, I think that's probably somewhat of an unfortunate thing, because if there's any, Protestant group that Lutherans are most, should have the most affinity for, it's Anglicans. Like we both have that kind of conservative Reformation. In other words, we've, kind of conserved elements of the medieval church and the medieval mass that other parts of the Protestant world didn't do to that extent.
Right.
So you obviously have done some work on Luther, and you're interested in Luther. So let's kind of start with, as an Anglican who's done work on Luther, what do you see as kind of Luther's influence on the Anglican Reformation, or even just your own thought as well?
Yeah. Well, from a historical perspective, there are different ways of approaching that question. We can look at we can raise the question of what is Lutheranism, and as a historian, what is Lutheranism in the 16th century? And we see that there were key moments in the Reformation in Germany, and there was development as well. So the same is perhaps more true of Anglicanism. I think you might agree that by the end of the 16th century, there was a pretty clear, there were pretty clear boundary lines.
Yes.
Pretty clear confessional definitions of what Lutheranism is or was. The same was not as clear in England. It really, you don't get, and perhaps you don't ever get really as clear boundary lines and definitions in Anglicanism as you do have in Lutheranism. But really, it wasn't really until the Restoration, the Great Restoration of 1660 in England, that you have this. It really becomes clear to everyone that the Anglican Church is not going to be a Puritan church, right? The Puritans are not really going to fit with the establishment, and that wasn't exactly clear. And the definition of Puritan wasn't really clear either. And today it's still a historical problem to try to define what that means. But so the question of where Luther is in the English Reformation is a very interesting one, and it's been treated by a few different scholars over the years. And you see the development of the 39 Articles, for example. You see Luther's influence in just the Articles of Religion before they became the 42 Articles, right, which were the predecessor to the 39. You had the 13 Articles, and a number of those showed a Lutheran influence. And to make it a long story short, what we have today as the 39 Articles, the first few of them show a heavy influence from Lutheranism, from the Wittenberg Articles and other statements of faith. So clearly, there is you can't think of the foundational documents of Anglicanism today, at least the classical foundational documents, without looking at Luther, right? So, and the same is true with Calvinism to a degree, right? Because John Calvin's Institutes at one point were based on Luther's catechism. Right. So to know Calvin, you need to look at Luther as well. So that's one answer to the question, is just that, the Protestant movement began with Luther. So you have to look to him to really know the origins of Anglicanism.
Yeah, and so when when you think about Luther's influence on Protestantism as a whole, you kind of can't help but making both the comparisons and kind of the contrasts with Luther and then other Reformation traditions as well. And that kind of comes out most starkly through the sacraments. I mean, that pretty clearly Luther saw that as the major issue, and regarding the Lord's Supper, but I think baptism as well, especially within the Reformed tradition, especially if you look at some of the Puritans. Certainly a sacramental theology that develops there is very different to what you see in something like the Westminster Confession of Faith. But Anglicanism, on the other hand, when I speak to Anglicans, I feel like I speak to Anglicans who, when I ask about their sacramental theology, some of them sound much more Lutheran, and some of them sound much more Calvinistic, and some of them sound Roman Catholic in their views of things like transubstantiation. So let's kind of go through sacramental theology, because I feel like that's maybe the major place where I often get questions, and especially for people interested in Lutheranism or looking at some more kind of classical traditions. That's a question that also comes up. So let's start. Let's start with baptism. Let's just say, what is there a single definitive Anglican view of baptism?
Well, the question, and our definitions of things in the modern world are complicated, right? With Lutheranism, like which denomination are we talking about, right? Which denominational statement? Is there a thing called classical Lutheranism? These are questions that we ask as Anglicans too, like whose version of Anglicanism, which book of common prayer, is a person using or a denomination using, and so the question can become more complicated based on which version of Anglicanism you're looking at. But historically speaking, for those who look back to the post-Restoration Church of England as giving a more definitive characteristic to Anglicanism, then there does seem to be a wide acceptance, a popular, at least among Anglican theologians of the time period, acceptance of the doctrine of baptismal regeneration. And it wasn't really a controversial topic, and it didn't become one in Anglicanism until the 19th century. So with the sort of fallout from the Oxford movement, there was a division in the Church of England between what became the evangelical camp and the Tractarian, as what the Oxford movement followers or writers were known as. And so then you have different camps sort of appealing to the past, and not, if you know anything about the 19th century, it was not the best century for historical analysis. There were all sorts of theoretical ideas about history, and so actually it was encouraged by many historians to read the past in a particular theoretical framework, and not even try to be unbiased in the way that we read history. So you see a lot of that sort of feeding into the divisions of that were going on in the Church of England in the 19th century. But prior to that, the doctrine of baptismal regeneration was firmly stated by Anglican divines, and you have evidence that they would appeal to in the formulary, what we call the formularies, which are the 39 articles, and the liturgy. So the Book of Common Prayer, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, which does say in the baptismal liturgy, the priest is to take the child and in his hands baptize them, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But then at one point says this, and seeing that this child is now regenerate. So just being taking a literal view of the liturgy, you would have to qualify. If you were trying to avoid the idea of baptismal regeneration, you'd have to qualify that language very heavily in order to avoid it.
So what does that mean for today? I mean, you bring up the divisions in the 19th century, and I do want to get into some of that as well, just more broadly, the camps that exist within Anglicanism that do seem like they kind of grow from that era. But what does that mean for, say, the Anglican Church of North America today? Is there a general consensus that, of baptismal regeneration, or is that a minority position? Is it a kind of 50-50 split? Or where would you kind of, if you had to categorize where the church would be today?
Well, I would say, that there is a sense of unity. The ACNA is still in its early stages.
Right.
So on the one hand, there are many differences. And the question of baptism is not really actually one of the hot button issues that threaten to cause division. But experientially, if I were to speak from my own experience, you find that often you encounter an Anglican priest from the ACNA, and they tend to see one of the distinctive features of Anglicanism as its high sacramentology. So
Right.
there's often, even if they don't state their doctrine of baptism in the exact phrase of baptismal regeneration, they often will want to frame a person, especially if the person's coming from evangelicalism into Anglicanism, they will want to help that person come to grips with just sacramentology in general. And so they will have a high view of the sacraments and the high view of baptism. But whether they state that in terms of baptismal regeneration, it depends on which what we call jurisdiction, or which bishop they happen to be under. Yeah.
Again, how would you, and I want to get into what some of those kind of debated issues are in the ACNA, just to kind of get the landscape here as well.
Sure.
But when you're talking about baptism and the efficacy of baptism, I think there's a big difference, at least between Lutheranism and, say, the Westminster Confession of Faith, in that the Westminster Confession at times can kind of use regenerative language relating to baptism, but then qualifies it very heavily with it's not necessarily at the moment of administration. And then, of course, if there is a regeneration tied to baptism in that system, it would only be for the elect, so that it becomes, well, the language empty sign has been used, at least by some theologians. So how would you see that within Anglicanism working out? Because I think that from a Lutheran perspective, when Lutheran writers have kind of tried to say, here are the differences between Lutheran and the Reformed tradition, that's really where they start, is the universality of grace and the universality of the grace that is offered and given in the means of grace. And that's going to be kind of the primary criticism for a lot of people related to baptism and the Lord's Supper. So if there is an approach that is baptismal regeneration, is it the assumption that every infant is regenerate, or is there a divorce between regeneration and baptism in some degree with relation to election, or how exactly does that work itself out?
Well, I would say that no, that's not something I've really encountered in the ACNA. I haven't really encountered that. I mean, you do have Reformed Anglicans, right? Who, and there are even various degrees of what that means. They often will appeal to a particular period in Anglican history, particularly that period prior to 1660, when there was some question as to whether Puritanism fit within the Anglican formularies, or whether it did not. And, we have had a history with Calvinism in the Church of England. Our approach, and I say our the official statements and the official decisions that took place in the Church of England, but the approach to Calvinism was not as, I guess you could say, not as rigid, not as strictly exclusive. So there wasn't a statement wherein Calvinism was clearly written out of the Anglican formularies. the decision was much more subtle. So it came really with Charles I and William Laud, who included a preface to the 39 Articles right at the time when the Synod of Dort, right after the Synod of Dort, but right at the time when that was still a real question in England, whether perhaps even the 39 Articles might be changed to be more Calvinistic. And Charles I wrote a preface that basically said, we're not changing the Articles at all, and we're going to stick to the clear and grammatical sense. So what is written in Article 17, which treats predestination, is going to remain what it is, and we're not going to add to it. Interestingly, Article 17 does not mention reprobation.
Right.
So it's much more Lutheran, I guess you could say, in that way. So that is seen historically as the clearest statement that you get really from the Church of England, that we're not going to move in that direction. So it's not typical to see it's not typical to see when it comes to the sacraments, even in that time period, it's not typical to see any mention of whether, or in any, even bringing up the question of election with regard to a person's baptism. But going back to the ACNA today, I've not run into that really. For the most part, those who call themselves Reformed Anglicans tend to be a minority. Not that Anglicans wouldn't be interested in reading John Calvin, or actually be excited about having read him, or even influenced by his thought. But what you typically see are people coming from evangelicalism, or appeals even to evangelicalism. So it's actually more common to see, if someone were going to limit the efficacy of baptism, it would be more common to do so in just generic evangelical terms. And you do get certain churches that emphasize the need for conversion in terms of a conversion experience.
Right.
I wouldn't say that was that's true of the ACNA as a whole, but you do find that. I would say that would be more common than the more Calvinistic reading of the sacraments.
Okay, yeah, I mean that's pretty much my experience with the ACNA as well. I mean, I haven't seen that, but I was just kind of curious historically if that was a perspective that was there at all. Now, speaking of some of those issues and what you bring up with Reformed Anglicans, and I do want to get back to the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, because I think that's going to be an essential question that Lutherans always want to ask about. We always want to talk about baptism. We always want to talk about the supper, and honestly, if there's unity on anything, like even if you read the most like liberal ELCA theologians, when they're speaking of baptism and the supper, they still sound a lot more like the most conservative confessional Lutherans out there. Like if there's anything that we agree on, it's that.
Yeah.
So, because that's kind of it becomes our definitive statement of our faith, is what do you say about the supper? Now, of course, the way that's explained sometimes can be very different as well, but at least, verbally it sounds the same. So, but thinking of these different groups within Anglicanism, I talked to some individuals who tell me that, the Anglican Church is essentially a Reformed church. And when I've made certain statements about the Reformed churches teach, X, Y, or Z, it seems like I would always have some Anglican commenting and saying, but Anglicans don't believe that. We're a Reformed church. So I always started kind of qualifying that and saying, I'm not including Anglicans here. But then I hear from others who say, we're the via media, we're not Protestants at all, so we're definitely not Reformed. So what are the different, if you could maybe just outline, what are the different views of like where the Anglican tradition fits? And by the way, you do find some similar divergences in Lutheranism too, over exactly where we fit. But yeah, if you could explain that a little bit.
Right. So if you've heard anything about Anglicanism, you probably know about some of the different categories that a person might put themselves in. We've mentioned some already. There's the Anglo-Catholic view of Anglicanism. And that actually isn't well defined either. You will find some
Right.
Anglo-Catholics who do pretty much everything Rome does, and you find differences actually between Anglo-Catholics in England versus Anglo-Catholics in North America. And you find there are these continuing Anglican jurisdictions with a whole alphabet soup, like the Anglican Province of America, the Anglican Catholic Church. Then you have the ACNA, which is a different thing. And you have, confusingly enough, you have Anglo-Catholics in the ACNA too. You have a couple of different
Right.
jurisdictions that are Anglo-Catholic. And so, there are many Anglo-Catholics who, will appeal to the same 17th century Church of England divines, like Lancelot Andrewes, for example, as Reformed Anglicans or evangelical Anglicans. So my view is usually just to try to avoid any sort of adjective added to Anglican and just be a churchman, because one of the key features of Anglicanism is conformity, right? Conforming to the rule that's been established by the church. So yeah, you have those different views, and not all of them are all that well defined. I would say there's probably more unity in those distinctions than people often talk about. So you go to an Anglican seminary even today, and you have so our systematic theology, which we don't have. But if we had something like that, it would be our historical commentaries on the 39 articles, so expositions of the 39 articles. And so I would say a couple of the most famous ones are the very perhaps low church, more evangelical, Griffith Thomas is his name, who did the exposition of the articles. And he actually, there are other ones, but anyway, so his appeals more, if we have to speak in really broad terms, his would be more of an appeal to the inward life of the faith, and less of what you get in the Anglo-Catholic, more emphasis on the external, in terms of the sacraments. Although I know this is not the clearest way of, these are very broad terms, but on the other hand, you have John Henry Newman's exposition of the 39 articles, which is a very self-consciously Roman, in terms of just looking at the 39 articles from the perspective of the Council of Trent way of reading the articles. And you have sort of something between those two, which is E.B. Pusey's reading of the 39 articles. And so if you read Pusey's reading of the 39 articles, it's not exactly Anglo-Catholic in the sense of the more Roman leaning Anglo-Catholics. He is self-consciously appealing to the formularies of the Church of England as he knew it and as he conformed to it. So there's unity there between churchmen, those who are looking at the past among Anglicans and saying, well, what has conformity meant in the past? And so there is a sense of unity in those documents that we have, and the divisions are, I don't think, as radical as they tend to be these days. But usually the radicalness is just on those who aren't quite as concerned with those founding documents. And you will find Anglo-Catholics who just completely disregard the 39 articles and say, well, we don't depend on anything that came out of the Reformation. And they even really just appeal to the Anglican Missal, and at that point there's not very much of historical churchmanship, at least in terms of churchmanship as it was reformed after the Reformation. So that would probably be the biggest distinction, the biggest difference between those Anglo-Catholics who find nothing in the Reformation, even the English Reformation, to identify with, and those who do.
Yeah, I think, in Lutheranism, we certainly have some similar divides, right? We have high church Lutherans. I mean, technically high and low church are really Anglican terms, not Lutheran ones, but we do have the Lutherans who refer to themselves as evangelical Catholics and would prefer not to see themselves as Protestants. We have kind of lower church, more pietist leaning Lutherans as well in our history. And so we have a kind of divide as well in some ways. But ultimately, for at least a lot of Lutheran groups, the thing that does tie us together, like, for example, I'm part of the American Association of Lutheran Churches. We subscribe fully to our Book of Concord, which is very detailed in a lot of ways. And I think if you went to some of our congregations, we have some that would certainly be more high church. That would certainly be more my leaning. And then there are some that are not so much, coming from a more Norwegian kind of low church pietist background initially. Yeah. So, but in light of that, like, we do have agreement in terms of the confessions. So even within that difference of worship and maybe difference of terminology and how we view certain elements, there's still largely an essential agreement in terms of fundamental doctrine. And that leads to, the question that I always have about Anglicanism, and I feel like I always get different answers, is what is the role of your confessions of faith? Like, what is the role of the 39 Articles? How are you required to subscribe to it? Because as you bring up, there are some Anglo-Catholics that are willing to just kind of throw it out altogether. Right. And that's really the big question that I often ask about Anglicanism is what exactly is the role of the confessions there? Yeah, that's a good question.
I would actually be comfortable worshiping in some Anglo-Catholic parishes. I don't consider myself an Anglo-Catholic, but I don't have as much of an issue with some of the ceremonial and even the ritual. But I think it's important to be united on the things that most unite us, and to find out what those things are, you really have to look back at our founding documents. And Anglicanism did have a Reformation, and there are documents that arose out of that to define what our unity would be based on. And really, that's what the formularies do. And that's really what the 39 Articles do. It really says, we believe in the Catholic faith that came to England, back in the 2nd century. What is the Catholic faith? Here are the 39 Articles of Unity that we can all unite on and say, here's what's essential for the church. And so I think it's important to be a part of an Anglican body that agrees with that agrees that the 39 Articles do have that role and have always had that function, at least since the Reformation. You don't have to be a Reformed Anglican to point that out. And that's one of the good things about the establishment of the ACNA, is that the 39 Articles are upheld as one of our founding documents. So, and I'm a part of the Reformed Episcopal Church as well. And the Reformed Episcopal Church to this day requires you to subscribe to the 39 Articles in order to become a priest.
Now, what is the difference between the Reformed Episcopal Church and Anglican Church of North America? I'm much more familiar with ACNA. I mean, I know of the Reformed Episcopal Church, but I'm not too well informed. So what's the
the Reformed Episcopal Church had brick and mortar. Before the ACNA was founded, the Reformed Episcopal Church was founded in 1873, if I'm correct. And so it had been around for quite some time, and it had gone through its own sort of transformation. And basically, our bishops were there at the beginning of the ACNA back in 2009 to help provide some structure.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I was living in Pittsburgh at the time that the ACNA was founded. So I'm very familiar with Ambridge, Trinity Ambridge, and kind of the situation with the founding of the ACNA. I have a lot of friends from college that went through Trinity Seminary. And, because of that, I've gotten a little bit of the taste of what some of the major differences among Anglicans are, because I have friends who are very much kind of pro women's ordination into the priesthood. And I have friends who are very much on the opposite side of that question. And so I see I've seen a large, division there. And I think at Trinity, I believe a woman teaches their homiletics courses. So, and I know that's one issue. So what are some of these kind of major dividing lines within, Anglicanism today?
Yeah, the one you raised is probably the most prominent, and that's the ordination of women to holy orders, as we call it. And as I said, I'm a part of the Reformed Episcopal Church, and we have the ACNA has a number of different jurisdictions within it, some of which were formed after the ACNA was founded. Okay. Those who were part of it as it was founding, like the Reformed Episcopal Church, have for the most part kept our denominational structures. Okay. So the Reformed Episcopal Church continues to function the way it did prior to the arrival to right. the organization of the ACNA, and we have never ordained women to the diaconate or the priesthood. We do have an order, which is not a holy order, but an order of deaconesses. Which is an ancient office in the church.
Yeah, we have that as well.
Okay, yeah. And so that is a major issue, and it's helpful if someone has concerns about that issue to know where their bishop stands on the matter. So some bishops are convinced that that women should be ordained to the priesthood and to the diaconate. Other bishops are not convinced about ordaining women to the priesthood, and so some of them will ordain them to the diaconate. But they're all in agreement that there's no real historical case for the ordination of women to the bishopric. So that's really where we are currently. And you see a lot of noise about this on the internet, and often it's the lay people who are making more noise about it than the clergy are. But there is some worry that this unity in our Constitution, the founding Constitution of the ACNA, which has basically said that we don't have to come to an agreement on the ordination of women.
Right.
For those who are strongly opposed to it, that's not a good thing in their mind. That the Constitution itself, they're hoping and praying that at some point the Constitution itself is rewritten, at least that clause of it. And then the others who believe that women should be encouraged to pursue holy orders would say the opposite, that they would want that to be
right.
To eventually become a statement in favor of the ordination of women, or at least they would just say that they're happy with it the way it is.
Yeah, I think there are certain issues that it does seem very difficult to kind of say, we'll just agree to disagree on. Yeah. Especially when you're because I was in the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, when I was younger, and we had a big debate over that exact issue. And it just seems like it just doesn't really work to kind of agree to disagree, at least in my experience, especially because if a woman is ordained and you don't believe that is valid, you're essentially saying your ordination is not valid. And you have to coexist in the same body. It just doesn't work very well. So I've just seen that tension play itself out. So that's obviously a major area, and that's probably the one that you see publicly the most. That's discussed. But what are some other areas where there is some maybe debate or division over within the Anglican Church today?
Well, there is division over issues that are not uncommon to other denominations, such as the question of sexuality and sexual orientation. How do you what's the most appropriate language for that? Does the church have a say in the language that people use to describe their sexual orientation, or must the church simply receive the language from those people themselves? That has actually caused quite of a stir just over the past week in the
Right.
ACNA, and you may have seen that. Certain people want the language of gay Christian or gay Anglican to be normalized by our bishops, with an official statement by the church that says that we love you, we accept you as a gay Christian. But the bishops have recently met, and their decision wasn't a quick one. They met and many times over the past year and determined that the most appropriate language would be a Christian with a particular sexual orientation, or a Christian with a particular leanings or proclivities toward a sexual orientation. But they rejected the language of gay Christian, and that did upset a number of people. And so, but it doesn't seem like the bishops are going to change their position on that. So.
Yeah, I have seen quite a bit of that. And on social media, I've seen some things from both sides. I know there was like some other statement that was drafted against what
right.
that the bishops had made on that question. And of course, everybody's dealing with this divisions over this issue and how to deal with the issue. Is that mostly an issue of what language to use, or is there, substantial difference in terms of allowance of those kinds of activities or of homosexual marriage within the ACNA at all? Or
no, not that I know of. There's no.
Okay.
I think everyone is in agreement that the practices are not encouraged, not accepted,
right.
as well as any sort of change in the definition of marriage is just out of the question.
Yeah. Okay. So this would be maybe similar to kind of what's going on in the PCA with the debates over like the Revoice conference and some of the language.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, very similar.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, those are the role of women and sexuality. I mean, of course, those are the issues that everybody's debating. I mean, those are the cultural issues too, so it makes sense.
Yeah.
Are there other significant points of debate today?
Well, we have plenty of them. There's plenty of them that we inherited from the past. We
have them too. Every tradition has them. So just curious kind of what the major ones are.
No, the ones you see the most are just, is it worth, just that old division between Anglo-Catholics and I would say classical Anglicans. And in a way, we're still working out what all of that means. And I think that's a good conversation for us to have. And like I said before, ultimately, there are jurisdictions that call themselves Anglican that, would for those who feel as though the Anglican formularies of the past are not things that we need to uphold. I mean, there are places where those folks can fit in more freely, and but the debate still continues over how much the Reformation really matters for who we are today.
So, what about charismatic Anglicans? Because that's something I always kind of wonder about, because I know that there is a charismatic contingent in the ACNA. Where do they kind of fit in to this broader spectrum?
Right. Yes, that's something I forgot about when you asked the question a minute ago. They are. I've been a member of an Anglican church when I lived in Canada that was more charismatic, and in my experience, it is very moderate, very mild, charismatic. Most people think of a charismatic service as like just a a Pentecostal holiness service, but within a liturgy, within a liturgical context, it's actually quite, it can often go unnoticed, really.
Mm.
So in the parish where I was, I didn't notice it. I had no idea what was going on for a while. And there was some flag waving and things like that mainly took place in the back, and they tried not to be too distracting with stuff like that. And there was some private speaking in tongues and private prophecies, but usually even the prophecies are not they're not unhinged. And what I mean by that is they are considered in the same light that St. Paul spoke of them, that the prophecies need to be in line with God's word. They need to be interpreted by someone who has knowledge in the Holy Scriptures. And so I haven't seen any sort of idea of new revelations and that sort of charismaticness. And it does pose a potential issue for those who are seeking to renew Anglicanism in its classical form. It's clearly not present in Anglicanism until the 20th century, so it's a fairly recent movement. And so I don't think that it's it's certainly not part of the historical established tradition.
Yeah, I mean, that's honestly pretty similar to where our association is as well. I mean, we've got some congregations that kind of lean a little bit in that direction. But I would say it's very mild compared to what you think of as kind of charismaticism within broader evangelicalism. Just in a liturgical context, I think it ends up looking much more subdued and very different.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, for sure. And then the thing that I wanted to get to that we haven't yet, but I feel like before we end, we need to touch on this, is the supper, just because this is the Lutheran issue that we all care about. And, my wife and I actually got married in an ACNA church. We had a friend that was a priest in Pennsylvania who married us. And so we had attended his congregation occasionally because he was a friend of ours, and they had like an evening service, so we could go to our Lutheran service and still attend the Anglican service at night. And I remember just kind of thinking through the language of the liturgical language of the supper in the Anglican service, and I always heard what seemed to be kind of Calvin's language in terms of partaking by faith to some degree. But then when we had spoken with our with the priest at that parish, what he articulated was more of a Lutheran view. So what would you say is, there probably isn't an Anglican view, because I know there's even some transubstantiation. I mean, I've read Newman on that question, and
basically, like I mentioned earlier, when it comes to baptismal regeneration, you get this sort of, there's a unity in the ACNA as to how we tend to speak as priests. We want people to come to understand the sacraments and even have a sacramental worldview and perspective, especially if they're coming from a non-sacramental place. And so we have one way of speaking that might not exactly be the letter of the 39 articles, for example. But I would say, in just general terms, you have a belief in the real presence of Christ in the bread and in the wine. Some people might not state it that way exactly. They might say, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. They might not narrow it down to the elements themselves. And then and that perhaps would lean more toward the Calvinistic view. But I would say that one way that we are a via media in many ways, at least our formularies are, trying to steer between more of a Calvinistic view and the Lutheran view. So I would say that we have, there is, obviously we don't have the language of ubiquity that you find among Lutherans, and so there's more. There's actually less. I should say more. There's less attempt to define the mode of presence
Right.
among Anglicans, if I had to say it that way.
And the main, the question that's always going to arise with Lutheran Calvinist debates, at least that Lutherans will often bring up, is the presence of Christ for the unworthy. Like
Right.
the question of, is there something objective about Christ's presence in the sacrament, in the reception itself, regardless of the manner of faith or the state of the heart,
Yeah.
or not?
Yeah.
And what would you say about that?
Well, I would say that that Anglicans have historically been aware of the problem of what's known as receptionism, and the more extreme versions of that, which make it seem as though the faith of the believer is what causes the real presence of Christ to be there. We've been aware of that for quite some time, and tried to articulate our view without moving in that direction, which is a way of saying, we articulate an objective presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but at the same time recognizing what our own articles say, which is that the unworthy do not receive him. And so how do we really explain what that means? I think one of the best explanations of that is by Richard Hooker, if you were to read him on this question. And he does go to great lengths to show that the unbelievers are truly given Christ, but there's a way in which, even truly being given him, they don't receive him. They don't receive his benefits and that sort of thing. Even among Calvinists, you'll have the admission that there is the eating and drinking of damnation. So there must be the giving of something, but I think the question comes down to, what that is. What is it?
Right. And certainly, with our emphasis on objectivity, we wouldn't go on then to say that, you receive forgiveness in life and all the benefits of the Eucharist even without faith. We say that they're there and Christ is there, but you are rejecting what is being given to you,
right,
through unbelief.
Yes, and that's usually what we would say too. And I think many Anglican priests are okay just outright saying our view is very Lutheran in that way. And because of that historical leaning on Lutheran statements of faith, that we feel comfortable saying that. Yeah.
I just finished reading Philip Carey's The Meaning of Protestant Theology. And I know he's an Anglican, and what he presents there, and in some of his other essays as well, is some very Lutheran views of the sacraments, even kind of, he sets Luther and Calvin essentially against one another and argues in favor of Luther's position. Yeah, I'm curious, are you familiar with his work and, his influence, or what is his influence in Anglican
Carey's
circles?
work? I'm familiar with his work on Augustine, his 2 books on Augustine and Faith and Grace, but I haven't had a chance to look at the most recent one. So it was an interesting book, nonetheless. I recommend it. I didn't agree with everything in there, but I recommend it. It was an interesting look at Luther and Augustine as well, and what he perceives as some differences between Luther and Calvin. I'm just always interested to hear, what people perceive of those issues from outside of the Lutheran tradition. Because certainly we have a vested interest in defending Luther's view. So it feels a little more sometimes unbiased, maybe, to hear an outside source dealing with some of those questions. So I know you've probably got to go here soon. I do. I've got to run. Got to run to Matins.
So I don't want to keep you, but let's. Do you have anything you want to shout out before you leave? Anywhere you want to say people can find you, look at your work, anything? Say anything you want before we go.
Sure. Well, I'm on Twitter, which might not be the best place to see me. I often end up deleting tweets more than I send them out. But I'm there if you want to look me up. That's pretty much the best place to locate me. I think I had a blog years ago, but that's not really active anymore. So yeah, I'm around. Look me up if you're interested in any of these questions, or you can find my profile and some information at the Davenant Institute website.
Okay, great. And what is your Twitter handle if people are looking for you there?
It's Eric M. Parker. Eric M as in man.
Okay, great. And you're probably wiser than I am for deleting tweets, because I just say things and sometimes I shouldn't. So, all right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this. And thanks everyone
for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Of course. And thanks everyone for watching and or listening to this. And we'll see you next time. God bless.